Massive thank you to everyone who is joining us for this event this evening, where we're going to be making the case for a different model of university funding for free education, as well as obviously making the crucial argument for why we need to oppose the tuition fee rises, which have recently been announced by the Department for Education. Young people and students are saddled with more debt than at any point in history now, and putting that up by £1,000 is not going to tackle the crisis that we're facing in higher education. It's absolutely fantastic tonight that we're being joined by a group of young student activists, trade union organisers, and grassroots campaigners, as well as special guests from the General Federation of Trade Unions, the Black Liberation Alliance, and a friend of the student movement and the anti-austerity movement, John McDonnell MP. I'm now going to pass over to our first speaker of the event, Niamh Iliff from the University of Nottingham and a fantastic student activist and trade union organiser. Over to you, Niamh.
Hello, thank you very much for having me and a wonderful introduction from Fraser, far too flattering. So I just really want to start by just highlighting the real experience for students today. I started uni in 2022. Since then, food bank usage with students has doubled just in my time as a student. Student poverty is at an all-time high, measured on every statistic you can possibly look at. We're seeing 35% of students go without heating in the winter, and student unions normalising using community pantries, sort of breakfast clubs and everything to literally feed students who cannot afford to eat. We're also seeing students in highest numbers of employment during their studies than we've ever seen before, with some of the lowest rights and protections at work in modern times in British history. So my question to really open this today is, why are we punishing working class students for doing what's right, what we're told to do, which is getting an education? University, for me, was always told to be something that would achieve class mobility. That's always the thing we're told, right? It means that you can go and improve yourself, get a really good job, look after your family. That's the myth that is not holding true anymore. Because students, working class students, are so dependent on wages every day, students are missing the social life, the university life that actually gives you those opportunities, that furthers yourself and your own personal development. And all of this stops the empowerment that comes from a further education experience. It stops that personal development promised to us by universities. And then people question why students are apathetic. This is exactly why, because we're left at the bottom of the chopping pile every time a budget comes around. We are always the first to bear the brunt of austerity. We are so alienated in our government's policies that people are turning to Reform, they're turning to Green Party, because the Labour Party is no longer looking after our best interests. Right now, the government has an opportunity to unite students and other communities that are faced by the cost of living crisis and bring about serious social change to show that a Labour government can provide that social mobility and give opportunities to working class people. And I just really want to touch on the actual student loan increase. I'm seeing a lot of stuff online, as I'm sure everyone else is, that it's not that much money. It's only a few £100s more a year. You already got 50 grand of debt. What's a few hundred more quid? Government funding in 2012, when student loans were introduced, was 75%. Students paid the extra 25% as a top up to cover this black hole in the funding. That's now dropped to 16%. Governments are paying 16% of our loan, that's it. The rest of it is all private debt, proving that in hard times, when people are struggling, it's big private loans that will bail us out. That is not the society that I want to live in. It's not the society that we want our students to grow up into. Repayments themselves have also been massively frozen. In 2012, when you started earning £21,000, that was when you'd be paying back your loans. That would be equivalent to 40 grand today to start paying back your loans, let alone the cost of living crisis, the highest debt since World War I. Students have been paying the price for years. This is not the first time they're increasing our loans. They've been doing it since they've brought it in. And unless we stand up and fight it, they will continue to pile more debt on the lowest paid in our society. The model has never worked in the first place. It's never solved the funding model for higher education, but commodified and destabilised the finances of higher education in this country. And the proof of this is that most students will never be able to pay back their loan. They say this themselves, it'll never be paid back. Why are we continuing to saddle students with debt, stop them accessing the benefits of higher education when they are never going to be able to pay it back? Joe Grady, the UCU General Secretary, has advocated for an increase in corporate tax of 4%. That would solve the entirety of the higher education debt crisis. An educated workforce is a more productive one. It should be corporate profits that are paying for our education, not working class students that are missing out on the opportunities that we are deserving to get. We need to build a framework that puts students and staff first ahead of private profits. Thank you very much.
That's fantastic. Thank you very much, Niamh. Someone who's doing some absolutely inspirational work, organising young workers as well as students, and really making that argument of as the economy gets worse, as it gets less sustainable, more and more young people are being forced into part-time work alongside their university. And this is why we have to make sure this is broad. We're tackling it on a social scale. We're not just looking at the tuition fee rise, we're looking at the whole marketisation of higher education as it's hitting students badly in every single part of our lives. I'm delighted now to pass on to our next speaker, Myriam Kane from the Black Liberation Alliance. Over to you, Myriam.
Thank you, Fraser. Thank you for organising such a timely event. The conversation around tuition fees and free education is fundamental because education is critical to advancement of humanity. So it should be part of organising as a part of our organising as trade unionists and as members of the civil society. I am the co-founder of the Black Liberation Alliance, an organization that represents African, Asian, Arab, Caribbean, Indigenous, mixed heritage, and other Black community descent. We exist to advance the liberation of our communities, and education is critical to that aim. Today, I want to talk about an issue that lies at the heart of equality, opportunity, and social progress in our country: the need for a free education in Britain. Education is often celebrated as the great equalizer, a pathway to opportunity that cuts across backgrounds, economic situations, and ethnicities. But for too many young people, particularly those from Black communities, that pathway is obstructed by the rising cost of higher education. Consider the impact of student debt on Black families in Britain. Black students are more likely to come from working class background and more likely to rely on loans and to fund their education. And once they graduate, they enter a job market that still discriminates against them. Studies have shown that Black people are more likely to be in lower paying jobs and are less likely to be promoted than their white counterpart with similar qualifications. This means that the debt taken on to pursue higher education becomes an anchor rather than a ladder, holding back our progress rather than propelling us forward. We must recognize that the current system is not broken. It was designed this way. The exclusionary price of education is part of the broader structure that perpetuates inequality. It keeps wealth concentrated in the hands of the few and prevents marginalized communities, especially Black communities, from accessing economic freedom. This is why we must take a radical stance. Imagine a Britain where working class students don't have to choose between their dreams and their debt. Imagine a Britain where we are encouraged to study, to innovate, and to lead without financial obstacles. Free education will mean a gateway to breaking down the barriers of elitism and privilege that stand in the way of our communities. But this won't happen unless we push for it. This will not happen if we remain quiet and wait for permission. Change has never come from silence. It comes from actions, from radical ideas that make those in power uncomfortable. It's time for us to demand free education as a right, not as a privilege. Additionally, free education will help address some of the economic inequalities that have held back community for generations. When working class and Black students have access to higher education without financial burden, they can gain the skills and qualification needed to secure higher paying jobs, invest in their communities, and break the cycle of poverty. This is how real progress is made, by providing opportunity to those who need it the most. And let's not forget that when we are told that we cannot afford to have free education, the truth is we cannot afford not to. Many of those in successive government who ended free education and drove its costs benefited from it themselves. So I won't take lecture from them on what's best for students. Policies that fail us on education are political vandalism. Without a skilled workforce, the economy suffers. Graduate and a qualified workforce is an investment that will pay back in tax revenue when people start working. So we needed jobs, we need skills, and we need education. But those in power will say we can't afford it. This is just not true. There is always enough money when war-mongering, austerity-driven billionaire like Trump and his counterpart around the world need it. They find money at our expense for wars, deportation scheme, and bankers' bonuses. When what we need is money for hospitals, education, and to stop the worst ravage of climate change. But that change is not coming from the powerful. I'm disappointed in Labour for raising tuition fees and for bringing in tuition fees in the first place. Both of these happened within weeks of the Blairs and Starmer landslides, when many young people voted to invest their hopes in a change and instead were given this. What this show it is up to us to organize on our campuses in the anti-austerity movement to champion the cause of education when our leaders failed to. Many of us in BLA were part of the Goldsmiths anti-racist occupation, which won scholarship for Palestinian students to be able to study here in Britain. It goes to show that when we fight for all our causes, we can win for a free Palestine and a free education. So we must reject those who tell us that we are not being realistic and that better future we strive for cannot be won. It can. So let's start mobilizing and organizing for radical change in our student unions, in our trade union, etc. We need a united front in all our society for us to win free education. Thank you for having me.
That's fantastic. Thank you very much, Myriam. I really want to echo what you said at the end there, especially about how we have to bring together our different movements, because it's the rhetoric around how we fund education that goes far further than just university students. It's this rhetoric of, oh, the money's going to have to come from somewhere, or someone's going to have to get hit hard in order to increase the funding here, which is what we have to challenge on a social level, because it's exactly the same which is used to justify cuts in other parts of the economy for other services and for other vulnerable groups. I'm now really pleased to pass over to another absolutely inspirational student activist, someone that I've seen has been willing to put themselves on the line. I believe we were both carried out by bailiffs in first year of university after having a minor disagreement with senior leadership about the price of rent, and someone who I'm sure many will know, Hasan Patel, over to you.
Hi, thanks for having me. My name's Hasan and I'm a student activist in Manchester. The introduction of tuition fees in 1998 to the British higher education system and nearly every single development since under both Labour and the Tories has been a catastrophe for students, staff, and Britain. The arrival of market logics turns students into consumers and sources of revenue, rather than as engaged citizens who want to learn and play an active role in shaping the world that we have inherited. This marketization has seeped into every part of my life, whether it be the extortionate rent I paid as a first-year student in university accommodation, or the £60,000 of debt I will be in once I graduate, or the 0-hour contract job that I need to top up my income. Last year, me and 400 other students at the University of Manchester organised a rent strike to protest against these squalid conditions that we had to endure in accommodation, and because of the spiralling and outright greedy levels of rent. For over 6 months, we collectively withheld over £2 million in rent payments. We occupied university buildings to have a clear and confident presence on campus, and we held demonstrations in the city. In a wider context of increasing state repression under the Tories, our university felt confident enough and emboldened in threatening us with expulsion, and 12 of us faced disciplinary action. They also took us to court and hired bailiffs to physically drag us out of our own university buildings for peacefully protesting. We fought back and we got the cases dropped on the condition of promising good behaviour. This is nothing new. The establishment knows that when we unite and fight, we can win, and win big, which is why they will try to shut us down. Imagine how different the outcome could have been if there was a politicized, thriving national student movement of thousands of students fighting back in solidarity with one another. That is what we need to build now. It's not easy, but it is our only option. This is the reality. The Labour Party are not going to hand us anything we want on a silver platter. We must force them to deliver on their agenda of national renewal, and that means fighting for the abolition of tuition fees, the reintroduction of living grants, a reversal of all austerity measures across the education system, handing back power to students and staff, and abolishing anti-trade union laws so that university staff can organise for better paying conditions. There are reasons to be hopeful. Earlier this year, students at the University of Columbia set off a wave of student encampments and protests across the world to pressure universities to divest and cut ties with Israel in the context of their campaign of genocide against the Palestinian people. And students have won on many campuses. Goldsmiths University students won undergraduate scholarships for Palestinian students and have been forced to actively call for a ceasefire. California State University of Sacramento won full divestment. Trinity College Dublin won all of their demands, including for full divestment. Trinity College in Cambridge has agreed to divest from arms companies. San Francisco State University won divestment from arms companies and successfully defended the right of students to political speech on campus. All of these wins happened in just a few months. It is now up to us to be inspired by this energy and build a diverse, fighting, decolonial student movement that wins a national education service free at the point of use from the cradle to the grave. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Hasan. As expected, that was really inspirational. I think covered so many of the points that we need to look at. And again, taking inspiration from what we're seeing internationally is the same, because the student movement now more than ever really needs to be learning and sharing our organising tactics. I think a big thing we're going to have to see going forward in the UK, now we've seen this, is an increased drive to organise and coordinate between different universities, between radical and student activist groups, if we're going to have the chance not just of opposing the tuition fee rise, but really making a strong case for why education should be free. I'm really pleased to introduce our next speaker, Myriam, who is the University of Sheffield's Student Union Education Officer and someone who does some incredible work. Over to you, Myriam.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to talk first a little bit about the general situation, and then I'm going to give a spin to play off Hasan's international solidarity. The current maintenance loan system and student loan system is unsustainable, and it's unable to sustain both students and universities at a time where the cost of living is high and when the cost of operations of universities are really high. Specifically for students, most people do not have money to live on only other student loans, with the average student living of 50p after paying for rent if they are living only other student loans, which means that most students are having to take part-time work, most students are having to take out even more loans, and more students are falling into student poverty. We're having to hand out, as other speakers have said, we're having to hand out food vouchers for community food banks at a rate never seen before, in a scale that is decimating not only our student communities, but also the other communities within the cities that we exist in that used to be able to be self-sustaining, but now have so much demand from students as well as members of the community that they're falling into disrepair. So this is not only affecting students, but it's also ensuring that people from the community, from communities, are not able to access the things that things like food banks were promising them in the first place. Additionally, student loans are going to put entire generations of young people into devastating debt. One that doesn't even take into account the kind of socioeconomic factors when being repaid. So as some of the other speakers have said, the people who are going to be the most affected by taking massive amounts of loan in order to be able to attend university are the people that used university and university education as a form of getting out of poverty in the first place, or as a form of ensuring that they were able to climb the social ladder. The people who are going to be the most affected by not being able to repay their student loans are people who are first generation students, are students of color, and are students from underrepresented backgrounds. Also, it's really important to note that the rise in tuition fee is less about the physical rise and more about the fact that the repayment of the loan is now being done in such a way that people are going to be to end up with unpayable debt that is going to absolutely decimate their ability to be able to move in the social ladder. I think, as has been pointed out by several student activists, it's not only that the student loan has gone up, but it's also that in the past few years, the student loan repayment plan has changed in such a way that it's becoming completely unsustainable for people to pay it back. Also, if we're being really, really practical, the raising of tuition fees doesn't actually address the problem of having well-funded a higher education system. Realistically, the amount of money that is being raised for universities by the rise is not going to be enough to put them out of their financial troubles, nor will it ever be. To continue to push for a tuition fee-based model of higher education is to be comfortable with seeing the decimation of our universities and our higher education system, because a system that consistently relies on people coming in is a system that is completely unsustainable and will stop existing at a certain point. To continue to sell marketization as a way to fix education is short-sighted, and it's based on this model that capitalism is based on, which is the model of line goes up. The assumption that there will be more students willing to pay more money that are consistently coming into our education system and consistently funding that. And that is like purely talking in practical terms, and not about the fact that the marketization of education destroys the purpose of education. It decimates what we're supposed to hold near and dear to our hearts. It creates an educational system that from the get-go is asking people to prioritize money rather than pure and unadulterated love for learning and education. The pursuit of knowledge in a space in which that pursuit is caveated by money is practically useless, because it means that students are going to be thinking more about what the education is going to give them practically, rather than actually thinking about education as a tool of self-development and improvement. And the perspective that I'm going to bring into this comes from the fact that, as you might be able to tell from my complexion and lovely accent, is that I'm an international student. And if nothing else I have said tonight resonates with you, I hope that these at least will. International students are being done dirty by the funding model that universities in the UK have, a system which is purely dependent on trying to get as many of us into the system, paying as much as possible, and then painting us all as rich kids that are more capable of paying extortionate fees, when the reality is that a lot of us, if you speak to most international students, are people who have taken out loans in order to come to the UK to study, or who have had their entire family's life savings spent on coming to the UK. Personally, my parents are spending about 70 to 80% of their income into me being here in the UK, and they've had to take out loans, and they've had to sell a lot of their personal assets. And this is the situation and I am one of the lucky international students, because there are some international students who are objectively worse off given the loans that they've had to take out or their situations in their home countries. Additionally, I want to talk about something that is slightly uncomfortable, which is that to be moving money from the global south, much of it in the form of loans or entire family savings, to the global north, to maintain the education system, which should be publicly funded and owned, is uncomfortable at best and a form of neo-colonialism at worst. Specifically, when visa requirements and expectations create a two-tiered system where a lot of us have been exploited for our money and then penalized for wanting to pursue higher education in the UK, but not by not being allowed to work more than 20 hours, by not being able to take any kind of public funds, by being completely left alone by the government, and then penalized whenever we miss a class or anything. Universities in the UK being funded by tuition fees creates problems for everyone. Every home undergraduate is struggling to pay for their rent and food. Every international student whose family sold their property and took aggressive and unpayable private loans. Every lecture that could have been structured better if the lecturer was paid more. Every university that is feeling the strain from an unreliable and predatory system for higher education is a consequence of an underfunded, marketized system that is not fit for purpose. There is strength in uniting those fights and an understanding that we're all fighting for the same thing, an education system that prioritizes learning, education, and people. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. That was fantastic. And I think you touched on some really important points there. I think it is a massive thing that often parts of the student organising movement does tend to overlook international students, and we have to understand, which is that if we're fighting for a liberated model of higher education, that means liberating for everyone, and we can't do that without bringing together all students and staff, because everyone is being negatively impacted by these models, and universities are just being incentivised to bring in these predatory policies which are treating everyone badly. And I think we have seen attempts by the media and often even universities themselves to almost try and divide international students and domestic students around, like you've said, these stereotypes, which often don't come out of nowhere. And I think it is often beneficial on the behalf of universities for that to happen within the student body. Before we pass on to our next speaker, I would just quickly like to thank Arise Festival, who have provided us with the digital platform and all the support for putting this event on tonight. Especially post-COVID, lots of bits of the student movement have been facing massive amounts of difficulties, and that's both from sort of organisational sides, but also the fact that students are just increasingly being faced with financial pressures, the increased digitisation of all my lectures are online now. It's harder for face-to-face organising to take place. So having spaces like this, and especially such a timely discussion so soon after policy announcement, is really important. And it's going to be the next steps over the next few weeks and months about how we build and coordinate the student response to this, which is going to be absolutely vital. So thanks again for everyone taking part, but also for Arise for letting us put on this brilliant event. I'd love to pass on to our next speaker now, Coll McCail, who is an activist and student at Glasgow University. I'm not going to make any comments about what Coll's tuition fees might be, because I'm sure he's going to have some absolutely fantastic insights for us there. Over to you, Coll.
Yeah, thanks very much for having me, folks. Appreciate the invite. I'll deal with Scottish tuition fees as part of my contribution, but there's a Stuart Hall quote that is important to start with, right? And it's: the university is a critical institution or it is nothing, right? And that is fundamentally why we're all here, because the introduction of tuition fees, let alone the raising of tuition fees, is an affront to the idea of the university as a critical institution, as a place where students, regardless of background, can come to learn. It is a basic affront to the right to learn, to define education, or to cut education, or to impose barriers to education as a consequence of income or background. Should never happen, let alone from a Labour government, let alone from a Labour government elected on a promise to change a quote-unquote broken education system across these islands from Scotland right through to the south of England. So why invite a Scottish student to talk about tuition fees at a rally like this? And it is true that I don't pay tuition fees. No one in Scotland does. That's not because the SNP are kind-hearted liberals who decided one day they woke up and thought we're going to cut tuition fees across Scotland. It's because the abolition of tuition fees was fought for and won by students across Scotland, as it will be eventually down south, and we have to have confidence in that. I think I'm here because when we fight against the introduction of tuition fees, when we fight against decisions to raise tuition fees, we fight, as has been said, against the marketisation of education more broadly, a marketisation of education that plagues and pervades the lives of both students and staff. At Glasgow University, the average staff member works 2 days unpaid a week. That's an incredible figure, and it's in an industry that is allowed to operate with a veneer of liberalism that prides itself on hard work, that prides itself on the idea that academics are expected to work more, to work longer hours for less pay, because academia is a noble pursuit and everybody should be prepared to invest unpaid labour as a consequence. That idea, that notion, is criminal in the first instance, and something that is entirely related to the fight against tuition fees. It's why we say our learning conditions are their learning, or their working conditions are our learning conditions wherever we can. The model of both further and higher education today that operates in Scotland and across England is something that Frederick Taylor and Henry Ford would be delighted by. It's a conveyor belt, right? You walk in the door and you roll off 3 years later. You don't get an education in between. It's Fordist. That is the word to describe how the system operates. And again, it's what we're fighting against. And it's atomized. It's individualized. You come into class, you put on your laptop, You bury your head in your laptop. You don't talk to the students around you. You're not in a class. You're an individual. You're not really a university or part of a community. You're an individual student as part of that community. There's a great quote from Jimmy Reid, who was a Scottish trade unionist communist, led the UCS working in Glasgow and was also a rector of Glasgow University in the 70s. And he defined alienation as the cry of men who feel themselves the victim of blind economic forces beyond their control. And that's what student life is today. It is deeply alienated from one another, alienated from staff. And they have used COVID, they have used the online nature of COVID to advance those conditions, to degrade our learning conditions and to degrade working conditions. So we're atomised, we're disconnected, and we're worn out. We work dead-end jobs to get by, to pay rent, to pay food costs. And the university cares not a jot about that. And I think that is something that has changed over the last 10 years. The liberal veneer that used to be pretty dominant at university, that would be summed up in some Latin motto at the bottom of every university's badge, is gone. And it's gone most clearly because these universities, these institutions operate for profit primarily and operate as businesses prepared to invest in genocide, as is happening across. Glasgow University has £8 million invested in BAE Systems, Thales, and other companies refused point blank to touch that money, regardless of the level of student support demonstrated in support of divestment, right? So the perception that these institutions have a moral credibility has gone. And it's gone not just because of how they treat their students, not just because of how they treat their staff, but because of where they put their money and because of the actions of the companies that they profit from. I think that this broader climate about alienation that I was talking about a minute ago, this climate where we feel, where we don't really know people at our universities unless you're on campus all the time, unless you make an effort, where the university makes no effort to integrate international students, where they're happy to let people live in accommodation in the one part of the city and not subsidise transport for people to get onto campus. All of these things. This climate is why Bridget Phillipson and the Labour government have opted to hike tuition fees now. They think they'll get away with it because they think the student movement is weaker than it was 10 years ago as a consequence of the marketisation of education. They want to take advantage of that weakness because they think Millbank won't happen to them. They think that they're not going to get hundreds of thousands of students storming Labour Party HQ as a consequence of their decision. And we have to be honest about the fact they're probably right. The student movement is weaker as a consequence of the marketisation of education, is weaker as a consequence of the perpetual barriers that universities have put on our ability to organise and on our ability to resist that marketisation. But that's why calls like tonight, which convene students from across the country, regardless of whether we pay tuition fees or not, are so important. And I think that it's been touched on, but I do think that Palestine activism on campuses across the country has shown an alternative, right? And there are beginning to be instances of national mobilisation, of cross-campus coordination. And that is heartening because it's something that we haven't seen over the last 10 years. You can chart the moments of politicisation that we've seen. In Scotland, 2014, the referendum, then you have politicisation around Corbyn, then you have the climate movement 2019, then you have cost of living 2022. And in those moments, what has been absent from most has been the student movement. It's not been at the forefront of these moments of politicisation in the way that it might have been 10 years ago. Again, we know why. We know it's because of the barriers that have been imposed on student organisation. But that is beginning to change. That changed last year on Palestine when students were in the forefront of the movement on campuses across the country and encampments. At Glasgow, we elected a rector with 80% of the vote on a pro-Palestinian platform. That man was Ghassan Abu Sitta, incredible surgeon, worked 90 days in Gaza between October and November. He was elected with double the turnout on the previous election, right? So that is evidence of breaking down those barriers to engaging students, breaking down that atomisation. And that's the real aim for us, is to be able to engage students in a mass manner, in a popular way. And we really need to work out how to do it. couple points, because I know I need to shut up. Politically, this is interesting, right? Because Labour are going to war with their base, and not for the first time since they took office in July. Students, no regard, taking advantage of. Pensioners, no regard, taking advantage of. They are prepared to go after everyone but those with the broadest shoulders. They'll go after if you're young, they'll go after you if you're old, but they won't go after you if you're in the top 1%. And that's the message that we have to popularise. I think that's critical. Second point, last point before I finish, is that even on their own terms, this does not make sense. Earlier in the year, when the GERS deficit figures came out, the only parts of this country that are operating not in a deficit just now are London and the southeast, and that's because of the imbalance in the economy. It's because of the dominance of financial services. Raising tuition fees does not correct the trajectory of British capitalism. It does not insulate British capitalism against the shocks that Rachel Reeves is so worried about. It does the opposite. It endangers this just transition to good green jobs that we so desperately need. It imposes another barrier on that transition because it removes working class people from getting the opportunity for good graduate jobs. On their own terms, this policy is disastrous, let alone the ideological implications that we know so well. So I do think we have to go after them on those terms as well as on our own, and I will shut up there. Thanks very much for having me.
That was fantastic, and thank you very much, Coll. What was a really, really comprehensive look at some of these issues we're facing. I really think one of the important points you talked on about in terms of Labour alienating their base through policies like this really brings it back down to something which hasn't necessarily got the amount of airtime it should have at the last general election, which was that uptick in young voters and students, especially younger men, voting Reform for the first time, an interesting shift in demographic changes. And I really don't think we can underestimate the potential danger of an extremely large group of young people and students who feel completely socially alienated, and the forces and the false ideas which might be able to move into that political vacuum, because the way a political vacuum works is it gets filled. That's what happens to vacuums, and I worry that if Labour is moving away from students and more people are becoming disillusioned, it does create a space for groups like Reform to move in. And we have also seen that just in the US elections. We're actually giving people a platform that doesn't give them any hope and tells them, your life isn't going to get that much better, does not work. And, we're going to have a lot of issues to face. And if we're not organising in our universities, things will only get worse. I'm now very, very pleased to pass over to Elliot Briffa, who is the City and Community Officer at the University of Manchester Students' Union and a brilliant housing rights activist and tenants' union organiser. So over to you, Elliot.
Hi, everyone. I'm Elliot. And as Fraser said, my background is primarily in sort of housing and tenant rights organising. And I wanted to take a bit of a different angle on the government's recent announcement. Focusing instead on the maintenance loan increase. Whilst the argument around tuition fees, arguing for the complete abolition of them is an incredibly important element of fighting against marketisation of education, I'm really concerned about the increase in maintenance fees. It sounds a bit counterintuitive, and don't get me wrong, the maintenance loan stagnation has been awful for students, and we need to see a movement towards grants rather than loans, similar to how the Welsh system of student finance works. But it's important to recognise the bastardisation of maintenance loans that we've seen over the past couple of decades, as they have effectively become a subsidy for landlords. To give an example for Manchester's situation, obviously, as Hasan said, student housing is quite a big deal here. We've had a lot of rent strikes and that sort of thing. The average maintenance loan in England is around £7,200 per year. Our university's accommodation website says that students should expect to pay about £6,570 for 41 weeks of rent when staying in the university's own accommodation. This would leave the average student with only £630 to sustain themselves and buy everything else they need for an entire academic year. Not to mention the 11 weeks of the year that the student isn't able to live in those halls. It's only a 40-week license. Obviously, that isn't livable, and of course, that harms working class, racialized, and queer and trans students the most, as they're the least likely to be able to get support from parents to make ends meet. And to sort of take it outside of the student perspective, what we see time and time again is every time housing benefits, be it local housing allowance, universal credit is increased, rents go up by landlords every single time those subsidies are increased. It goes directly to the landlord. The tenant doesn't see a penny. During lockdown, when universal credit was increased with the sole aim of preventing people falling in rent arrears, many tenants received notices of rent increases the same day the government announced the policy, before it even actually come into effect. We will not see this increase in maintenance loan. It will go directly to landlords, and it is effectively going to be an extra revenue stream for universities, as an overwhelming number of them are landlords. The University of Manchester has over 80,000 units of student accommodation. They're building a lot more. They're one of the biggest landlords in Manchester, and you know that money is just going to them, and that's why we're seeing that universities like Manchester are actually arguing for more maintenance loans, because you know, to a degree, they know they're going to get that money themselves. And that's why it's really crucial that the student movement is organising alongside the tenant movement. Unions like Greater Manchester Tenants Union, London Renters Union, and Living Rent in Scotland, who themselves played a very large role in getting a form of rent controls passed by the Scottish Parliament. Not the best form of rent controls, a lot to be improved on, but that is a huge margin, a huge goal, and something that a couple of years ago would have seemed completely impossible. But the reality is we can actually, within our lifetime, to have rent controls, and it's something that we used to have in this country up until the 80s, following the Glasgow rent strike. But yeah, pushing for not only the demarketisation of education, but also the decommodification of housing is one of our most crucial battles. It will only be rent controls that will ensure that students can afford to survive their time at university. It's up to us to get organised for free education and free housing.
Fantastic. Thank you, Elliot, and thank you for the work you do as well, organising students. Like you said, this is going to have to be a broad coalition. We're going to need going forward, not just students making, you know, the social and economic case for free education, but organising demonstrations, organising campaign actions, but then also building those relationships with and actively participating in tenants' unions, in renters' rights organisations, and of course also trade unions, as we are seeing this significant spike in students in part-time work. I believe in a single 12-month period over the last year, it was a 25% increase in the number of students in part-time work. So it's increasingly obvious that it's our housing and our workers' rights which are sort of intersecting and combining with the marketisation of higher education to cause us ever more issues. I'm delighted now to pass on to our next speaker, Mads Wainman, who is the Disabled Students Officer at the University of Warwick. Over to you, Mads.
Hello. Yes, I first of all just want to say thank you to everyone at Arise and Fraser and Niamh for organising this. And yeah, the NUS found that a third of students are living on less than £50 a month. And with a rising cost of living crisis that is continuing to happen and food bank usage doubling, to up tuition fee loans is quite frankly unthinkable. And yet it has happened. Increased accommodation costs have hit the majority of universities. Warwick has seen an increase of 70% between 2023 and 2024. And it is so difficult for so many students, but I do want to specifically focus on disability and disabled students, because for 14 long years, we have been at the forefront of the outfall of austerity policies. It is mainly disabled people who have passed away because of policies enacted through austerity. And to continue that policy agenda is to continue to discriminate against disabled people. The current disabled students allowance has cut the ability to cover accommodation fees. So disabled students will end up paying more for accessible accommodation and will not gain assistance from the state to cover up that difference. And alongside that, we have a rising mental health crisis that is decimating universities, and our university communities are struggling. They really are. Austerity is not the answer, because these policies that come along that cut the funding to mental health services and mental health hubs, they're leading to an increase in suicides. And policies that are meant to tackle mental health leading to an increase in suicide is not okay. I mean, Wes Streeting has floated the idea of bringing in employment advisors into mental health hospitals. People who are in the most vulnerable situations, who are going through the most difficult situation of their entire life, will be given assistance on how to get a job at a time when we are facing multiple scandals in multiple hospitals for their lack of patient care and for the lack of patient dignity. That is not the answer, and that is not the solution. And universities have a responsibility in the mental health crisis to intervene and to prevent mental health when it first starts to show, because the majority of people will begin their mental health struggles at university. And mental health is like any other illness and any other disease. If you catch it early, you can help cure it. But if you catch it late, it can be fatal. And it is a really, really difficult time right now for anyone with a disability and anyone with a mental health condition, because Wes Streeting is refusing to listen to us on so many of our experiences. Talking a bit more about wider universities now, the absolute lack of government support for postgraduate students is absolutely appalling. The university can decide what fees to charge students for postgraduate. That is down to the university's discretion. However, the government subsidy is £12,000, and that's all you are given, £12,000 at the beginning of the year. For most universities, that doesn't even cover the tuition fee. So you have to get a scholarship. And if you can't get a scholarship, what are working class students meant to do? And the academic market at the minute is so difficult that if you are a working class student who wants to become an academic, it is virtually impossible. There's a casualisation of contracts that is just continually happening up and down the country. And this tuition fee rise, the extra money will not be going to our university lecturers. They will not be going to student support schemes. They will be going to new buildings and new decorations and to management pay. And, you know, here at Warwick, we had the Faculty of Arts building, which was built and opened fairly recently. It cost £57.4 million. And this building was built without a fire lift, which means the evacuation policy for wheelchair users, there isn't one. Recently, this has been changed, but to implement a building where there wasn't even a fire evacuation policy for wheelchair users in 2021, I believe, is a complete and utter disgrace. So the academic market, it's not fit for purpose. And on top of that, we're seeing universities spend their money on buildings that are not even suitable for the students that are using them. The UCU have also had many disagreements with university management on all of these kinds of things. But for postgraduate researchers and postgraduate taught, there's a very limited amount of support even from the central UCU. So PGRs and PGTs need to get our support. However, university and student activism can be central to change, and there definitely is hope. I mean, every single issue that you can possibly think of over the history of labour struggles started in universities and were driven by university students alongside university staff. And there are so many ways to get involved in creating solidarity between students and staff on campus, and it is one of the most enriching things. The Warwick Student Staff Solidarity Network has created access to food campaigns, demilitarization campaigns. There are so many things that we have done that is just, I'm so proud and privileged to be a part of it. And I just want to kind of draw attention to that form of organizing and to kind of have those discussions with your lecturers. I mean, Warwick Stands with Palestine and Warwick Student Staff Solidarity Network came together to create this, which is a 30-page document. You can download it for free. It is called An Investment in Injustice, the University of Warwick's Complicity in Genocide, the Arms Trade and Apartheid in Occupied Palestine. And this is a 30-page document that really deeply outlines every single way in which the university has continued to invest in the Israeli arms trade and has continued to ignore any attempts to change this. And to come out with that document as a piece of research between staff and students is something that is so incredible. And yeah, I want to finish off as a Warwick student. I think it would be sacrilegious for me not to quote E.P. Thompson at the end. And E.P. Thompson did write, "The University of Warwick only began to find its identity in times of crisis." And so I just really hope that we can come together, we can work with our staff, we can work with the labour movement, and we can find our identity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mads. That was brilliant. And I hope as the student movement itself begin to increase our level of organisation in the face of the crises that we are going to face. I'm really pleased to pass to our next speaker, Gawain Little, who is the General Secretary of the General Federation of Trade Unions. As we've already heard from some speakers, we're not just going to be able to make this fight as students. We're going to need our trade unions and our tenants unions, and really build that alliance.
Thank you very much, Fraser, and thank you for the invitation to join you today. Really pleased to be able to join this rally for free education and to bring solidarity to you from the trade union movement. It's an issue which I think is absolutely essential. I was actually in the first year of the introduction of tuition fees myself when I went to university, and in many ways, I guess I was lucky. My family income was low enough that I fell below the threshold, and I was one of a handful of students in the country whose local authority paid their tuition fees for them in that first year. But the introduction of tuition fees at the time at a rate of £3,000 was already deterring many from applying for university. We've seen it grow exponentially since then, and the impact that it has a far greater impact than it did at that time. Fundamentally charging for higher education and refusing to invest in higher education, which is what this is incredibly short-sighted. And short-sighted, I believe, in three ways in particular. First of all, in terms of equity, and we've already heard from some of the previous speakers some of the impacts that tuition fees and the costs of university education is already having on people, both in terms of deterring people from going to university, from accessing higher education, but also in terms of forcing them to work multiple jobs throughout their courses, impacting on their ability to access the courses, impacting on their well-being, on their mental health, etc. The fact is, if we refuse to invest in education, how are we investing in the future and in an equitable future for all? And of course, as we know, the fact is, when you have inequality within the system, when you have people who aren't able to access higher education, who aren't able to progress through that route, it impacts on everybody. It impacts right across our economy. The greater the inequality in an economy, the less efficient that economy is overall, and the more the entire population suffers. And of course, the answer to that isn't some graduate tax or some further means testing of tuition fees. Study after study has shown that in terms of social benefits like access to education, the most efficient, most effective, and most cost-effective method of investment is universal provision combined with progressive taxation. What we need isn't trying to catch a few people in a net to prevent them from falling through the gaps. What we need is investment in an education system that is free from the cradle to the grave, free not just at the point of delivery, but completely free, paid for through progressive taxation and state investment. That is the most efficient model. And if as a country we want to move forward, it's the one that provides best in terms of equity, equality across the system. But it's not just on access to higher education that I believe that tuition fees have an impact. They have an impact on the whole system, on the relationships within the system. The moment that you start charging for education, that you commodify education, you change the relationship between students and their teachers, their lecturers. What should be an educational relationship becomes a relationship of purchasing something, a consumer relationship. And we've seen this when unions have been on strike recently and universities have been saying, well, should we be offering some kind of rebate to students campaigning to get their fees back because their sessions weren't taught during strikes? Instead of building solidarity, it turns people into adversarial partners who are looking to gain something from each other. Transactional relationships, not educational relationships. We need to take that commodification and the transactional relationships out of education and build back into educational relationships that are about developing whole people and developing education right across our society. It also has an impact in terms of changing the relationships in the system on what people do when they leave university. Those who've racked up thousands and thousands of pounds of debt through tuition fees and through paying their way through university are more likely to be forced into careers where they can pay off some of that debt, rather than careers which may in fact be more socially useful, as we see fewer and fewer people going into careers like teaching, like education, like health, etc. Yes, we need more investment to raise pay in those sectors, but we also need to not saddle people with the debt from their education, which forces them away from going into those socially useful areas of the economy. But the third impact, and one that I think is often neglected, that's absolutely crucial, is the overall impact on our economy of lack of investment. If we look at the recent cost of living crisis that Britain has just been through, the major reason that it was so deep in this country, that it took so long to recover, far longer than many other developed economies, is because of a lack of investment in our economy, a lack of investment in the economy that leads to lower productivity, weaknesses on the supply side, meaning that we are far more crisis prone and far less able to respond to external economic shocks. Now, the solution to that is a comprehensive economic plan which involves investing right across the economy, but part of that investment has to be in education, in technology, to develop that productivity within the British economy, to develop the supply side, to make the economy more robust. So it has this a lack of investment in education has this huge economic impact right across the economy, causing and deepening that cost of living crisis for everybody, regardless of whether they themselves have to pay tuition fees or have been to university. So what we need is investment across the economy in all of our public services, including education, rent controls, price controls, as have been discussed before, in order to set our economy back on the right track. And until we have that kind of industrial plan and investment in the economy, including education, the scrapping of tuition fees and free education from the cradle to the grave, it will be impossible to see the full benefits of the economy we could create in this country. So as trade unions, we want to stand with you, work with you to fight not just for the future of higher education, actually for the future of our entire country. Thank you.
Thank you, Gawain. Some crucial points there. And again, strengthening the alliance between the student movement and the trade union movement is going to be absolutely crucial to resisting all forms of cuts and all forms of economic changes which are based on arguments which simply do not hold up to the sort of economy we're heading into. And that is increasingly becoming clear that you cannot, for example, with universities, just keep the broken system going as it is. Every single person is losing out from it. I'm really, really pleased now to pass on to our last speaker, and someone who, while I hope they need no introduction, I'll give a short one anyway. An incredible friend of the student movement, the anti-austerity movement, and someone who has fought for economic justice for his entire life. John McDonnell, MP for Hayes and Harlington. Over to you, John.
Thanks, Fraser. I just briefly want to make 3 points just to follow on from the points that a number of people have been making. Just as a preface, though, can I send my solidarity to the SOAS students who have been having injunctions imposed upon them for the protest camp that they set up during the summer. I visited the camp not to speak, just to listen to the speeches, and I just thought it was an eloquent protest about what was happening in Gaza, and to have people threatened with injunctions and prevented from going on site and things like that, I just think it's absolutely appalling. So I just want to express my solidarity with that group of students in particular. I want to make 3 points, basically, and it follows on from what people have been saying, Cal and yourself, Fraser, in particular. And it's, first of all, is to sort of situate the student struggle now in what's happening overall with regard to the Labour government. Very briefly, my view is this, that we were elated, I certainly was, to get rid of the Tories after 14 years. And it was important, therefore, to celebrate that. But the reality is now, and I think each person has really referred to it, is since Labour has been in government, the danger is this, that they do seem to be systematically alienating different sections of community and different elements of support that actually brought them into government, whether it's the pensioners with the winter fuel allowance cut, or as Mads has said, with regard to now the threat of the 3 billion savings, supposedly savings, but in reality cuts in terms of support and benefits for disabled people. And now the rise in the tuition fees, alienating students and young people overall. And my fear is this, and I've said it publicly enough times, and I'm trying to get the message across as much as I can to the current Labour leadership, that unless people see unless they feel a change after that election, unless they feel their lives are improving, their living standards, their quality of life are improving, by the time we get to midterm for Labour government, that's the point that a number of people have made, there's a real fear that there'll be a reaction against Labour in government, and it won't necessarily, if we don't organise, it won't be a reaction to the left, it could be a reaction to the right. And as you've said, I think, Fraser, reform is just sitting there almost waiting for that gift to fall into their hands. And that's exactly what's happened in Italy. It's exactly what's happened in France and Germany. And we've seen it now with Trump in America. And so my view at the moment is our job in every aspect of struggle at the moment is to try and, I think, build support now for that midterm period when Labour, I think there's the potential of them being in crisis. And we've got to be there, I think, mobilizing people to, in some ways, it's a matter of mobilizing them to pressurize a Labour government to be a Labour government. And that means preparing a programme as an alternative, which is, I think, then at that stage with Labour in crisis, we've got the opportunity of actually having the debate of what a real government, a real Labour government should do. And one element of that has to be about making sure education overall is properly funded. And you can't run a university system or a higher education system without significant public investment. And it's as simple as that. You can't, there's no other way. So the second point I want to make is to recognise that tuition fees are an aberration in relation to the whole history of the labour and trade union movement in this country. When Labour was founded and the trade union movement came together, one of the key ethoses in the Labour Party and the trade union movement was the fundamental importance of education to liberate people, to give them a quality of life. Yes, it was to ensure they had the proper skills to earn a decent living, of course it was, but it was much broader than that. It was a basic human right, access to education. And some people on the Labour front bench seem to have forgotten the very history of our own party and movement and that commitment. And that commitment was in the hardest of times as well. I've been looking at how policy on education developed in the Labour Party, and I'll just read one quote. This is a policy paper developed by the Labour Party. It's called Labour's Home Policy. This is what it said on education. We propose, therefore, so to reshape the educational system as to bring it within reach of all children and young persons, irrespective of parental income or occupation, the opportunity for the fullest development of their powers, because we refuse to perpetuate a vicious class distinction in the training of the national mind. That was a policy document produced in the hardest of times, 1940. The Battle of Britain was going on at the time, and yet they were discussing the educational system they wanted to create, and it was a Labour Party document. So after the Second World War, the debate of the welfare state that was introduced was about what we now describe as universal basic services, and it was health, education, and a safety net to ensure social security, social net, so people weren't in poverty. So right the way through the labour and trade union history, for over a century and a half virtually, education was always going to be free at the point of use, free at the point of demand, if you like. And when the tuition fee debate was brought about under Blair, I was a Labour MP at the time. I voted against. They only got it through with a handful of votes. But what happened is that from Thatcher onwards, the neoliberalism permeated, exactly as has been described by Myriam and others. Neoliberalism permeated the Labour Party, and as a result of that, they were absolutely convinced, that the hidden hand of the market would always produce the best outcomes. And to have a market, you have to have commodities. So they created education into a commodity. But we have to remind them, education has always been seen within our movement as a gift from one generation to another, and a right of one generation to ensure that they receive that gift and have access to it. So I think the important thing for us is to get across to people that this is an aberration, a cul-de-sac they've gone down that we have to pull them back from. And again, others have said it. It's inevitable they're going to have to. The system is in crisis because the funding regime they introduced is unsustainable. I sit in Parliament year after year, and I've watched them come forward with proposals where they write off the debt. They write off the debt in the billions because it's just not paid. The latest figure is 83% now will not pay for their student loans off. So therefore, any government, whoever's in power, has to, my view, is faced with a crisis of funding of education because this system is not working. And therefore, one of our jobs, and it's the third point I make really, is as we mobilise people now for that midterm of a Labour government to provide an alternative, we've got to develop that alternative. And we need really now to start doing a bit of number crunching and a bit of policy development. The obvious solutions really is to recognise the forms of the forms of funding that we have got to be based upon redistribution of wealth and income. And so I can't think of any other ways than a fair taxation system, which is based upon income tax, higher levels of income tax earners paying more, corporation tax, so the corporations pay their way, and that includes the financial transaction tax in the city, where the profiteers are making fortunes at the moment. It does mean we need to open up again the debate about a wealth tax. And I have a personal thing as well that I've been campaigning on for a number of years, which is land value tax as well, because we don't discuss the issue of land wealth in this country. There is more of a discussion in Scotland, less in England itself. So there's opportunities there where we can basically say to those, as Labour goes, I think, into crisis midterm, this is an aberration, is completely contrary to our whole ethos and our history. It's based upon the failure of a system that is going to bring whoever's in government into crisis. And here's an alternative that we can mobilise behind. The point that I think, I'm not sure someone made it about, it's very difficult to mobilise students at the moment, etc. Can I just say, there's sometimes a rosy myth that we create about past movements as well. I was involved in all the way through in the last surge of student activity. Actually, I was on the demonstration that went to Millbank. I wasn't at Millbank at the time, but bizarrely, I'd left the demonstration to go and have a meeting with the Police Federation. But anyway, that's another issue altogether. But that didn't, that came as a result of a lot of organisation. And it came, because I was at most of those meetings, it came at meetings like this early on where people thought, well, we'll never be able to mobilise students on any scale and all the rest of it. And then the argument was put, the discussions took place, the basic organisation on the ground took place, and there was a mass mobilisation. And as others have said, we've seen large numbers of students and young people in terms of leading the demonstrations with regard to Palestine in many instances. So there's a raw material there that I think in terms of that can be mobilised in terms of focusing them on the iniquities that people are facing. Mads has given you some good examples about what's happening with disabled people. Elliot, in terms of what's happening with regard to the rip-off of people on housing as well. And I agree with the rent controls issue, by the way, too. So I think there's a raw material and there's a real opportunity emerging here, but it will require a fair amount of effort. So that's why I want to thank Arise for organising this. I've really learned a lot from it, and I'm really grateful to be invited. But it's now as the work really has got to start in earnest. We've got about 18 months, I think, to really mobilise, because there'll be that opportunity arising where we can put an alternative. And I think we'll be in a majoritarian position to be able to achieve its implementation. It's a shame that we have a Labour government that doesn't recognise it needs to be more radical. But, radical change, as others have said, I think Maria said it, it doesn't come from above. It comes from us. It comes from people on the ground. And that means in every mechanism possible. And the link up with the trade union movement is going to be key on this one, but the link up with regard to other movements and street activity is absolutely key as well. We've got a coalition to build here in this next 18 months. Thanks, Fraser, for inviting me along. I'm really grateful.
Thank you very much, John, and thank you for your words as well. I think what you said there, especially about how, this is where the organising starts. This isn't just a nice meeting for us here from our fantastic speakers, although everyone has been brilliant, but this is really where, the work begins. We have to start organising around this. There's going to have to be a really serious movement to coordinate between more university groups, between, our grassroots activists, our SU officers, but also with organisations, because there's so many, both trade unions that are active at universities, groups like Unis Resist Border Controls, and student campaigns around Palestine, around rent justice. We are going to have to really do some work and also make sure Central Latter is making this argument for free education, giving students something to mobilise around. So this is not the last meeting, this is just the first going forward. So I'd love to thank everyone for coming along, all of our fantastic speakers, and again, Arise Festival for giving us the platform to put on this event. Thanks very much.